Grace Williams held the syringe up to the light. Her hands trembled. Clear liquid. No label. She'd found it hidden in Charlotte Hayes's designer purse, the same purse the billionaire's fiancé carried everywhere like a weapon. For 3 weeks, 5-year-old Sophie Anderson had been dying. Doctors couldn't explain it. But Grace knew. She'd known the moment she smelled that juice box. Now she had proof. And a choice. Accuse a wealthy white woman with no evidence anyone would believe, or set a trap and catch a killer. What Grace did next would either save a child's life or destroy her own. Before we begin, drop a comment. What city are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't already hit subscribe, you don't want to miss what happens next. Grace Williams had been cleaning rich people's houses for 23 years. She'd learned the rules early. Keep your head down. Do your job. Don't ask questions. Don't get involved. But the moment she heard Sophie Anderson crying behind that bathroom door, every rule she'd ever learned went straight out the window. "Sophie," Grace knocked softly. "Baby, you okay in there?" No answer, just the sound of a small body retching. Grace pushed the door open. The 5-year-old was curled on the cold tile floor, her arms wrapped around her stomach, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She looked up at Grace with eyes that held too much pain for a child her age. "My tummy hurts again, Grace." Again. That word hit Grace like a punch to the chest. This was the 4th time this week, the 3rd week in a row. "Okay, baby. Okay." Grace knelt beside her, pressing the back of her hand to Sophie's forehead. Cool. Clammy. Wrong. "Let's get you cleaned up." She lifted Sophie, God the child weighed nothing, and carried her back to bed. As she tucked the blankets around that small, trembling body, Sophie grabbed her hand. "Grace." "Yes, baby. Am I dying?" The question stopped Grace's heart. "No, sweetheart. No, you're not dying. Don't you ever think that." Charlotte said sometimes little girls get sick and never get better. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "She said it happens all the time." Grace went very still. "When did Charlotte say that?" "Yesterday, when you went to the store." Sophie's eyes were already closing. Exhaustion pulling her under. "She said I should be brave. Because sometimes..." The child fell asleep before she could finish. Grace stood there for a long time staring at Sophie's pale face, her mind racing. Charlotte Hayes. Richard Anderson's perfect fiancée. The woman with the magazine cover smile and the designer everything had told a sick 5-year-old that little girls sometimes die. What kind of person says that to a child Grace knew? Deep in her gut, in that place where instinct lives, she knew. But knowing wasn't proof. And without proof, Grace Williams was just a black housekeeper accusing a wealthy white woman of what? Being cruel, being suspicious, being the kind of person who made a child's skin crawl. No one would believe her. No one ever did. Richard Anderson came home at 7 p.m., same as always. Grace heard his car in the driveway, heard the front door open, heard Charlotte's heels clicking across the marble as she rushed to greet him. "Darling, how was your day?" Grace stood in the kitchen pretending to wash dishes, listening. "Long." Richard's voice was tired. "How's Sophie?" "Oh, the poor angel. She had another episode this afternoon. I've been with her all day making sure she's comfortable." Liar. Charlotte had been at a spa. Grace had seen the appointment on the calendar. The woman hadn't set foot in Sophie's room until 10 minutes before Richard's car pulled up. "I'm worried, Richard." Charlotte's voice dripped with concern. "Maybe we should take her to another specialist, someone who actually knows what they're doing. The doctors at UCSF are the best in the country. Well, clearly they're missing something. Our little girl is suffering." Our little girl. The words made Grace's stomach turn. Sophie wasn't Charlotte's. She never would be. "I'll call Dr. Martinez in the morning," Richard said. "Schedule more tests. You're such a good father. A pause. The sound of a kiss. I don't know what Sophie and I would do without you. Grace gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. She'd worked for Richard Anderson for 3 years. She'd been there when his wife Sophie's mother died in a car accident. She'd watched him fall apart and slowly put himself back together, one painful piece at a time. She'd seen him try to be both mother and father to a daughter who still cried for her mama in the middle of the night. Richard wasn't a bad man. He was a grieving man, a lonely man, a man desperate to believe that love could find him again. And Charlotte Hayes had walked into his life like an answered prayer. Beautiful, charming, attentive. She knew exactly what to say, exactly how to smile, exactly when to touch his arm, or laugh at his jokes, or look at him like he was the only man in the world. Grace had seen it before women who targeted wealthy men like heat-seeking missiles. But Charlotte was different. Charlotte was better at it than anyone Grace had ever met. And now Sophie was sick, getting sicker every day, and no one could figure out why. Coincidence. Grace didn't believe in coincidences. The next morning, Grace arrived at 5 a.m. same as always. Coffee first, then breakfast prep, then Sophie's medications, vitamins, probiotics, the supplements Charlotte insisted the child needed. Grace stared at the row of bottles on the counter. She'd never questioned them before. Why would she? Charlotte had worked in pharmaceuticals. She knew about this stuff. But now, in the gray light of early morning, Grace picked up each bottle and read the labels. Vitamin D, vitamin C, fish oil, elderberry extract, a probiotic blend. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. She put them back feeling foolish. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe Charlotte was exactly what she appeared to be, a caring woman who loved Richard and wanted to help his daughter. Maybe Grace's instincts were wrong. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Charlotte appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in designer athleisure, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect ponytail. She looked surprised to see Grace. "You're here early." "Same time as always, ma'am." Charlotte crossed to the coffee maker, poured herself a cup, and leaned against the counter. Her eyes never left Grace. "How long have you worked for Richard?" 3 years. "That's a long time." Charlotte sipped her coffee. "You must feel very attached to this family." Something in her tone made Grace's skin prickle. "I care about Sophie, if that's what you mean." "Of course you do. She's a sweet child." Charlotte set down her cup. "But you understand, don't you, that things are going to change around here? Once Richard and I are married, I'll be making some adjustments to the household." Grace said nothing. "We'll probably need to streamline the staff. Nothing personal, just efficiency." Charlotte smiled. "I'm sure you understand." The threat was clear, crystal clear. Grace met Charlotte's eyes. "I understand perfectly, ma'am." "Good." Charlotte picked up her coffee and headed for the door. "Oh, and Grace, make sure Sophie drinks all her juice this morning. She's been leaving half of it, and she needs the nutrients." Then she was gone. Grace stood alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding. She walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and pulled out one of Sophie's juice boxes. Organic apple juice. The kind Charlotte bought in bulk from some specialty store across town. Grace held it up to the light. It looked normal. It smelled normal. But when she opened the straw hole and sniffed, something made her stop. A faint metallic scent. Barely there. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Grace's hands began to shake. "I need you to test something for me." Grace stood outside the chemistry building at UC Berkeley, her nephew Marcus jogging toward her with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He was 22, brilliant, and the only person in the world Grace trusted completely. "Auntie Grace." Marcus looked confused. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "No." Grace pulled the juice box from her purse. "I need you to test this. I need to know what's in it." Marcus took the box, turned it over in his hands. "Test it for what?" "I don't know. Anything. Everything. Just tell me if there's something in there that shouldn't be." Auntie, you're scaring me. What's going on? Grace looked at her nephew, this good boy who'd grown into a good man who'd worked his way through school on scholarships and late-night study sessions, who'd never forgotten where he came from. The little girl I take care of, Sophie. She's been sick for weeks. Doctors can't find anything wrong. Grace's voice dropped. But I think someone's hurting her. I think someone's putting something in her food. Marcus went pale. You think she's being poisoned? I don't know. That's why I need you to test it. Auntie, this is serious, if you're right. I know how serious it is. Grace gripped his arm. That's why I'm coming to you. Please, Marcus. I can't go to the police with a suspicion. I need proof. Marcus stared at the juice box in his hands. Then he nodded. I can run some tests. Basic toxicology. It'll take a day or two. Thank you. Grace hugged him hard. And Marcus? Don't tell anyone. Not a soul. I won't. He pulled back, his young face set with determination. But Auntie, if I find something, you need to be ready. Because whoever's doing this, they're not going to stop. Grace nodded. She knew. She'd known from the moment Sophie asked if she was dying. The next 2 days were the longest of Grace's life. She went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, caring for Sophie, while her mind screamed with questions she couldn't answer. She watched Charlotte move through the house like a queen surveying her kingdom, all smiles and sweetness when Richard was around, cold and calculating when he wasn't. She watched Sophie get weaker. The child could barely keep food down now. She slept most of the day, her small body curled into a ball, her face drawn with pain. Richard called more doctors, scheduled more appointments, paced the hallways at night like a man being torn apart from the inside. And Charlotte was always there, always concerned, always helpful. Maybe we should try a different diet, she suggested at dinner, her hand resting on Richard's arm. Sometimes children develop sensitivities. I know a nutritionist who might be able to help. Anything, Richard said. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. I'll try anything. You're such a good father. Charlotte squeezed his hand. Sophie's lucky to have you. Grace served the meal in silence. Her jaw clenched so tight it ached. That night, after everyone was asleep, Grace's phone buzzed. Marcus. We need to talk. Call me now. Grace slipped out of her room and into the garden, the cold night air biting at her skin. She dialed Marcus's number with trembling fingers. He answered on the first ring. Auntie? What did you find? There was a long pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was shaking. Ethylene glycol. Grace closed her eyes. What is that? Antifreeze. Marcus's voice cracked. Someone put antifreeze in that juice box. Someone is poisoning that little girl. Grace's knees buckled. She grabbed a garden bench to keep from falling. Are you sure? I ran the test 3 times. I'm sure. Marcus was crying now. Auntie, this is attempted murder. You have to call the police. I can't. Grace's mind was racing. Not yet. I don't have enough. You have the juice box. You have my test results. And Charlotte will say I planted it. She'll say I contaminated it. She'll say I'm a jealous employee trying to frame her. Grace's voice hardened. You know how this works, Marcus. A black woman accusing a white woman with money and connections. Without ironclad proof, they'll destroy me. And Sophie will still die. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, what are you going to do? Grace stared up at the mansion, its windows dark, its secrets hidden. I'm going to catch her in the act. The next morning, Grace arrived at 4 a.m. Earlier than usual. She needed time. She moved through the kitchen in the darkness, her heart pounding, her hands steady. She pulled her phone from her pocket and propped it on top of the refrigerator, hidden behind a ceramic fruit bowl, angled perfectly at the counter, where Sophie's breakfast was prepared every morning. She pressed record. The red dot blinked silently. Then Grace began her normal routine. Coffee, breakfast prep. The careful arrangement of Sophie's medications and vitamins, and that damned juice box. At 6:30, footsteps on the stairs. Grace's breath caught. Charlotte appeared in the kitchen doorway dressed in silk and designer slippers, her hair already perfect, even though it was barely dawn. Her eyes swept the room, assessing, calculating. "You're here early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." Grace kept her voice neutral. "Worried about Sophie." Charlotte poured herself coffee. "Richard's leaving for Seattle this afternoon. He'll be gone until Thursday. I told him I'd take care of things here." "Of course." Charlotte set down her cup and turned to face Grace directly. "You know I've been thinking about what we discussed the other day." "Ma'am?" "The household changes." Charlotte smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate your dedication, Grace. I really do. But this family is about to enter a new chapter. Richard and I are getting married. Sophie needs stability, consistency, a mother figure she can depend on." "I understand." "Do you—" Charlotte stepped closer. "Because I need you to understand that things are going to change very soon, and the people who can't adapt to those changes, well, they won't have a place here anymore." Grace met her eyes, held them. "I've always adapted, ma'am. It's how I've survived." Something flickered in Charlotte's expression. Surprise, respect, or something darker. "Good." Charlotte turned back to the counter. "Now I want to prepare Sophie's breakfast myself this morning. You've been working so hard. Take a break." Grace's heart stopped. This was it. "That's not necessary, ma'am. It's my job." "I insist." Charlotte's voice sharpened. "Go. Take a moment for yourself. I'll handle things here." Grace hesitated, making it look real. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She walked toward the doorway, her legs threatening to give out. At the last second, she ducked around the corner, out of sight, but not out of earshot. Her phone was still recording. Grace held her breath and listened. She heard the pantry door open, the clink of glass, a cabinet being opened, the one where the cleaning supplies were kept. Then the unmistakable sound of liquid being poured. Grace peered around the corner. Charlotte stood at the counter, her back to the doorway. In her hand was a small glass bottle with no label. She'd produced a syringe from her designer purse and was drawing clear liquid from the bottle with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. Then she picked up Sophie's juice box. She inserted the syringe into the straw hole. She pressed the plunger. Grace watched as Charlotte Hayes, Richard Anderson's perfect fiancée, the woman who called Sophie "our little girl," injected poison directly into a child's drink. Charlotte withdrew the syringe, wiped it clean with a paper towel, and slipped both the bottle and syringe back into her purse. She arranged the juice box on a breakfast tray alongside cut fruit and toast, her movements calm, practiced utterly without conscience. "Grace?" Charlotte called out. "Can you come back in here?" Grace forced herself to move, forced her face into neutrality, forced her hands to stop shaking as she stepped back into the kitchen. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte gestured to the tray with that magazine cover smile. "Can you bring this up to Sophie when she wakes? I have a Pilates class." Grace looked at the tray, at the poisoned juice box, at the fruit and toast arranged so carefully beside it. "Of course. Make sure she drinks all of it." Charlotte grabbed her purse, the one containing the murder weapon, and headed for the door. "She needs the nutrients." Then she was gone. Grace stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the breakfast tray. Make sure she drinks all of it. The casual cruelty of those words. The absolute certainty that Grace would obey. The complete confidence that no one would ever suspect. Grace walked to the refrigerator and retrieved her phone. She stopped the recording and played it back, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. The video was clear. Charlotte's face, her hands, the syringe, the juice box. Everything. Grace saved the video to 3 different cloud accounts. Then she picked up the poisoned juice box, carried it to the sink, and poured every drop down the drain. She replaced it with the juice box she'd bought herself from a different store, one Charlotte had never touched. Then, Grace Williams, a black housekeeper who'd spent 23 years keeping her head down and staying out of trouble, picked up her phone and dialed 911. San Francisco Police Department, what's your emergency? Grace took a deep breath. I need to report an attempted murder. A woman named Charlotte Hayes is poisoning a 5-year-old girl named Sophie Anderson. I have video evidence, and I need help immediately. The operator's voice sharpened. Ma'am, stay on the line. I'm dispatching officers to your location now. Grace stayed on the line, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself breathe. The police arrived in 23 minutes. Grace had counted every second standing at the kitchen window watching the driveway, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She'd already sent the video to Marcus to her personal email to a cloud storage account she'd created 6 months ago and never used. If something happened to her, if Charlotte somehow made this all disappear, the evidence would survive. She heard the sirens first, distant, then closer, then cutting off abruptly as 2 unmarked cars pulled through the mansion's iron gates. Grace met them at the front door. The woman in the lead was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. She held up a badge. Detective Sarah Ortiz, SFPD. You're Grace Williams. Yes. You called about an attempted murder. Yes. Grace stepped back, opening the door wider. Please, come in. Detective Ortiz entered first, followed by 3 uniformed officers. Her eyes swept the foyer, taking in the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the kind of wealth that most people only saw in magazines. Where's the child now? Upstairs. Sleeping. She's been very sick. And the suspect? Pilates class. She'll be back in about 40 minutes. Ortiz nodded at 2 of the officers. Start a perimeter sweep. Don't let anyone in or out without my authorization. She turned back to Grace. Show me the video. Grace pulled out her phone, opened the recording, and handed it over. She watched Ortiz's face as the detective pressed play, watched the professional mask slip just for a moment when Charlotte inserted the syringe into Sophie's juice box. Jesus Christ, one of the officers muttered. Ortiz's jaw tightened. Where's the juice box now? I poured it out. I couldn't let her drink it. The poison? Down the drain. But I saved 4 others from before my nephew tested them at his lab at UC Berkeley. They all came back positive for ethylene glycol. Ortiz looked up sharply. Antifreeze? Yes. Where are those juice boxes? I have 3 in my room. The 4th is at my nephew's lab with his test results. Grace's voice was steady now, calmer than she'd expected. The waiting was over. The secret was out. Whatever happened next, at least she wasn't carrying this alone anymore. I also have text messages between us documenting everything. Time-stamped. Ortiz handed the phone back and pulled out her own. I'm calling for an ambulance. We need to get that child to a hospital immediately for a full toxicology workup. She met Grace's eyes. You did good, Ms. Williams. You may have saved her life. Grace shook her head. She's not saved yet. Not until Charlotte's in handcuffs. That's going to happen. Ortiz's voice was hard. I promise you that. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. Grace led the paramedics upstairs to Sophie's room, her heart breaking with every step. The child was still asleep, curled into a ball, her breathing shallow, her face so pale it was almost translucent. Sophie. Grace knelt beside the bed, brushing hair from the little girl's forehead. Sophie, baby, wake up. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, confused, scared. Grace, what's happening? Some people are here to help you, sweetheart. They're going to take you to the hospital. The hospital? Sophie's voice trembled. Am I getting sicker? No, baby. You're going to get better now. I promise. One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, crouched beside Grace. Hey there, Sophie. I'm Maria. We're going to take really good care of you. Okay? Can you be brave for me? Sophie looked at Grace, searching her face for reassurance. "It's okay," Grace said softly. "I'll be right there with you. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie nodded slowly. "Okay." The paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, gentle as handling glass. Grace walked beside them, holding Sophie's hand as they carried her down the stairs and out to the waiting ambulance. Detective Ortiz stopped them at the door. "Ms. Williams, I need you to stay here. When the suspect returns, I need you to act normal. Can you do that?" Grace looked at Sophie at the IV already being inserted into her tiny arm at the monitors being attached to her chest. "I'm not leaving her." "I understand. But if Charlotte Hayes sees police cars in the driveway, she'll run. She'll destroy evidence. She might have accomplices we don't know about." Ortiz's voice softened. "I know what I'm asking. But this is how we make sure she doesn't get away with this." Grace closed her eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to climb into that ambulance to hold Sophie's hand all the way to the hospital, to never let her out of sight again. But Ortiz was right. Charlotte was smart. Charlotte was careful. And Charlotte had been doing this long enough to know how to disappear. "Okay." Grace released Sophie's hand. "Okay, I'll stay." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Grace, you're not coming." Grace leaned down and kissed the child's forehead. "I'll be there soon, mi amor. I promise. You be brave for Maria, okay? And when you wake up, I'll be right there beside you. Promise. Promise." The ambulance doors closed. Grace watched it pull away, sirens off, disappearing down the long driveway and through the gates. Then she turned back to the house. Ortiz was already positioning officers out of sight behind hedges inside the garage around the back of the property. "When she pulls in," Ortiz said, "let her come inside. Talk to her normally. We'll handle the rest." Grace nodded. Her hands were shaking again, but her voice was steady. "I've been acting normal around that woman for 3 years. 40 more minutes won't kill me." Ortiz almost smiled. "You're tougher than you look, Ms. Williams." "I had to be." Charlotte's white Mercedes pulled through the gates at exactly 9:47 a.m. Grace watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to relax her shoulders, unclench her jaw, smooth her expression into the neutral mask she'd worn for 23 years. Just another morning, just another day. Nothing wrong, nothing unusual. The front door opened. "Grace!" Charlotte's voice echoed through the foyer. "I'm back. Did Sophie eat her breakfast?" Grace walked out of the kitchen, a dish towel in her hands, the picture of domestic normalcy. "She wasn't hungry this morning. Just wanted to sleep." Charlotte frowned, setting her designer gym bag on the entryway bench. "That's concerning. She needs to keep her strength up." She started toward the stairs. "I'll go check on her." "She's not there." Charlotte stopped, turned slowly. "What do you mean she's not there?" Mr. Anderson called. The lie came easily, too easily. "He wanted her taken to UCSF for more tests. The ambulance came about 30 minutes ago." Charlotte's expression flickered. Surprise. Calculation. Something that might have been fear. "He didn't tell me." It was last minute. He sounded worried. Charlotte pulled out her phone, started scrolling. "He hasn't called me. He hasn't texted." She looked up at Grace, her eyes narrowing. "That's strange, don't you think? I'm sure he's just busy with the doctors." Charlotte studied Grace for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Suspicion sharp and cold. "You seem very calm about all this, Grace." "Should I not be?" "A child you've cared for 3 years is rushed to the hospital and you're standing here folding dish towels like nothing happened." Grace met her eyes, held them. "I've learned not to panic, ma'am. It doesn't help anyone." The silence stretched between them, thick with things unspoken. Charlotte took a step closer. "You know, Grace, I've always wondered about you. You're very observant, always watching, always listening. Another step. Sometimes I think you see more than you let on. I just do my job, ma'am. Do you? Charlotte's smile was thin, dangerous. Because lately I've had the strangest feeling that you don't trust me, that you're waiting for me to make a mistake. Grace's pulse spiked, but she didn't look away. I'm just a housekeeper, ma'am. I don't think about things like trust. Everyone thinks about trust. Charlotte was close now, close enough that Grace could smell her perfume, something expensive, something floral, something that would forever remind Grace of poison. The question is whether you're smart enough to know which side to be on. Before Grace could respond, the front door burst open. Detective Ortiz stepped through, badge raised, flanked by 2 officers with hands on their weapons. Charlotte Hayes. Charlotte spun around, her face going white. Who the hell are you? Detective Sarah Ortiz, San Francisco Police Department. You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Sophie Anderson. What? Charlotte's voice pitched high, incredulous. That's insane. I haven't. You have the right to remain silent. Ortiz advanced, pulling handcuffs from her belt. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is ridiculous. Charlotte backed away, her eyes darting between Ortiz and Grace. Grace, tell them this is a mistake. Grace said nothing. You have the right to an attorney. Ortiz grabbed Charlotte's wrist, spinning her around. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Don't touch me. Charlotte struggled, her composure cracking. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my fiancé is? Richard Anderson will destroy you for this. The handcuffs clicked shut. Ma'am, we have video evidence of you injecting poison into a child's juice box this morning. Ortiz's voice was ice. We have laboratory confirmation of ethylene glycol in multiple beverages you prepared. And we have 3 weeks of a dying 5-year-old who couldn't understand why her body was betraying her. Charlotte went still. Then she turned to look at Grace. The mask was gone now. The perfect smile, the caring concern, the loving future stepmother, all of it stripped away, revealing something underneath that made Grace's blood run cold. Hatred. Pure, undiluted hatred. You, Charlotte breathed. You did this. Grace stepped forward. No, you did this. You poisoned a child. You tried to murder a 5-year-old girl for money. I just made sure you got caught. Charlotte lunged at her, but Ortiz yanked her back. Get her out of here, Ortiz ordered. The officers dragged Charlotte toward the door, but she kept screaming over her shoulder, her voice echoing through the marble foyer. You think you've won. You think this is over. I'll destroy you, Grace. I'll tell them you planted everything. I'll tell them you're obsessed with Sophie, that you've been trying to take her from Richard since the day I arrived. No one will believe a word you say. The door slammed shut behind her. Grace stood in the sudden silence, her whole body trembling. Ortiz approached her, expression softening. She's wrong, you know. We have everything we need. The video, the lab results, the juice boxes and evidence. She's not getting out of this. I know. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. I need to see Sophie. I need to know she's okay. I'll drive you myself. They found Sophie in the pediatric ICU at UCSF Medical Center. Grace had been in hospitals before, visiting sick relatives, taking children to emergency rooms, waiting in plastic chairs for news that might never come. But she'd never seen anything like this. Sophie lay in a bed that seemed to swallow her whole, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and tracked every heartbeat, every breath. An IV snaked into her arm. A monitor clipped to her finger. Wires disappeared beneath her hospital gown, measuring things Grace couldn't understand. She looked so small, so fragile, so close to gone. Grace sank into the chair beside the bed and took Sophie's hand. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Sophie's eyes fluttered open. Grace? Her voice was hoarse, weak. "You came. I promised, didn't I?" A tiny smile crossed Sophie's face. "My tummy doesn't hurt so much anymore." "That's good, sweetheart. That's so good. The doctor said they're going to make me all better." "They are. They're going to take such good care of you." Sophie's fingers tightened around Grace's hand. "Grace, where's Charlotte?" Grace hesitated. How do you explain evil to a child? How do you tell a 5-year-old that the woman who was supposed to become her mother had been trying to kill her? "Charlotte's not going to be around anymore, baby." "Why not?" "Because she did some very bad things. Things that hurt you. And now she has to face the consequences." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this with the solemn gravity that children bring to things they don't fully understand. "Did she make me sick?" Grace closed her eyes. The truth burned in her throat. "Yes, sweetheart. She did." "Why?" "I don't know, baby. Some people do terrible things for reasons that don't make sense to anyone but themselves." Sophie's lower lip trembled. "I thought she loved me." The words shattered something inside Grace's chest. "I know, baby. I know. But I love you. Your daddy loves you. And we're never going to let anyone hurt you again." Sophie squeezed her hand tighter. "You saved me, Grace." No." Sophie's eyes, so old for such a young face, held Grace's. "Maria told me. She said you found the poison. She said you called the police. She said you're a hero." Grace couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face. "I'm not a hero, baby. I'm just someone who loves you." "That's what heroes are," Sophie whispered. "People who love you enough to be brave." Grace pulled the child into her arms carefully, mindful of the wires and tubes, and held her like she'd never let go. Richard Anderson arrived 2 hours later. Grace heard him before she saw him, heard his voice in the hallway, raised and desperate, demanding answers from nurses and doctors and anyone who would listen. "Where is she? Where's my daughter?" She stepped out of Sophie's room just as he came around the corner. He looked like a man who'd been destroyed and reassembled. Wrong eyes, wild face, gray tie, loosened shirt, half untucked. "Grace." He grabbed her shoulders. "They called me. They told me—" His voice broke. "They told me Charlotte was poisoning her. Is that true? Is that possible?" "It's true, Mr. Anderson." "No." He shook his head, backing away. "No, that's not Charlotte loves Sophie. She loves me. We're getting married. This has to be a mistake." "There's no mistake." Grace kept her voice steady, even as her heart ached for him. "I have video evidence of Charlotte adding antifreeze to Sophie's juice box. The police have it. The doctors confirmed the poisoning." Richard stared at her, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally, slowly, the dawning horror of understanding. "Antifreeze," he whispered. "She was using antifreeze. For at least 3 weeks, probably longer." 3 weeks. His legs seemed to give out. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold hospital floor. 3 weeks, and I didn't notice. I didn't see. I thought it was a stomach bug. I thought the doctors were missing something. I thought—" He looked up at Grace with devastation in his eyes. "I almost lost her. I almost lost my daughter because I was too blind to see the monster I brought into our home." Grace knelt beside him. "You didn't know. Charlotte was very good at hiding who she really was." "You knew?" Richard's voice was raw. "You tried to tell me. Months ago you told me something wasn't right about her. You told me Sophie seemed afraid around her, and I said—" He covered his face with his hands. "I said you were being overprotective. I said Charlotte was wonderful. I said you needed to give her a chance. You loved her. You wanted to believe. And my daughter almost died because of it." Richard looked at her through his fingers. "Why didn't you push harder? Why didn't you make me listen?" Grace sat back on her heels. Because I'm a housekeeper, Mr. Anderson, a black woman in a white man's house. You think anyone would have believed me over her? She shook her head. I had to find proof. I had to catch her in the act, because my word against hers was never going to be enough. Richard was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with shame. I'm sorry, Grace, I'm so sorry. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to your daughter, and then be the father she needs. Richard pushed himself to his feet, wiped his face, and took a deep breath. Can I see her? She's been asking for you. Grace led him to Sophie's room, stepping back as he rushed to his daughter's bedside. Sophie's face lit up when she saw him. Daddy! Richard gathered her into his arms, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. I'm here, baby girl. Daddy's here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's okay, Daddy. Sophie patted his back, comforting him the way children do when they don't understand the weight of what's happened. Grace saved me. She's a hero. Richard looked up at Grace standing in the doorway, tears streaming down his face. Yes, he said softly. She is. Dr. Patel arrived an hour later with the full toxicology report. Grace stood in the corner of Sophie's room watching as the doctor explained what had been done to her, the systematic poisoning, the damage to her kidneys, the months of recovery that lay ahead. The good news, Dr. Patel said, is that we caught it in time. A few more weeks of exposure at this level, and we'd be having a very different conversation. But Sophie's young and strong. With proper treatment, she should make a full recovery. Richard's hands were shaking. What kind of treatment? We've started her on fomepizole to counteract the ethylene glycol. She'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, possibly 2. After that, regular follow-ups to monitor her kidney function. Physical therapy to rebuild her strength. Dr. Patel paused. And I'd recommend counseling. For both of you. What happened here wasn't just physical. The psychological impact of this kind of betrayal, especially on a child, can be profound. Richard nodded slowly. Whatever she needs. Whatever it takes. After the doctor left, Richard turned to Grace. The police told me they found evidence on Charlotte's laptop. Search history. Research on antifreeze poisoning. How much to use. How to avoid detection. Grace said nothing. She planned this. Richard's voice cracked. From the very beginning, before we even got engaged, before she ever said she loved me. He looked at Sophie, sleeping now, exhausted from the ordeal. She was going to marry me and kill my daughter. And I was going to let her. You didn't know. I should have known. He turned to face Grace fully. You knew. From the first day she walked into this house, you knew something was wrong. I saw it in your eyes. And I ignored it. I ignored you. Mr. Anderson. Richard. He stepped closer. After everything you've done, call me Richard. Grace hesitated. Richard. What matters now is that Sophie's alive. She's going to get better. Charlotte's going to prison. The rest doesn't matter. It matters to me. Richard took her hands in his. You risked everything to save my daughter. Your job, your safety, your future. You went up against a woman who had every advantage, money, connections, my blind trust, and you didn't back down. I just did what anyone would have done. No. Richard shook his head. That's not true, and you know it. Most people would have looked the other way. Most people would have told themselves it wasn't their business, that they didn't have enough proof, that no one would believe them anyway. You didn't do that. You fought for Sophie when no one else would. Grace looked down at their joined hands, his pale, hers dark, both trembling. She's a good kid, Grace said softly. She deserves better than what the world's given her. She deserves you. Grace looked up. What? Stay with us. Richard's voice was urgent. Not as an employee, as family. Help me raise her. Help me be the father I should have been all along. I don't trust anyone else, not anymore, not after this. Grace pulled her hands back. Mr. Anderson, Richard, you don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stay, to be part of our lives, to help me make sure Sophie grows up safe and loved and protected. He paused. I'll pay you whatever you want. Benefits, retirement, anything. But more than that, it's not about money. I know it's not. That's why I'm asking. Richard took a step back, giving her space. You're the only person who put Sophie first. The only one who saw the truth when everyone else, including me, was blind. I need someone like that in my daughter's life. In my life. Grace looked at Sophie sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed. This child she'd cared for since she was 2 years old. This child she'd carried through nightmares and sick days and scraped knees. This child she'd watched Charlotte slowly poison while the world turned a blind eye. Okay, Grace whispered. Richard's breath caught. Okay, I'll stay. Grace met his eyes. But not because of money. And not because you asked. I'll stay because that little girl needs someone who'll fight for her. And I'm not done fighting. Richard nodded slowly, relief flooding his face. Thank you, Grace. Thank you. Grace turned back to Sophie's bedside and took the child's hand. Don't thank me yet. Charlotte's been arrested, but this isn't over. There's going to be a trial. Lawyers, media, questions, and Charlotte's going to fight back with everything she has. Let her fight. Richard's voice hardened. I'll spend every dollar I have to make sure she never sees the outside of a prison cell. It's not about money. Grace looked at him. It's about truth, and the truth is messy. The truth is painful. The truth means everyone's going to know what happened in your house, what Charlotte did, what you missed. She paused. Are you ready for that? Richard looked at his daughter at the IV in her arm, the monitors tracking her heartbeat, the pale face that was already starting to regain color. I let a monster into my home, he said quietly. I let her hurt my child. If exposing that truth is the price of keeping Sophie safe, then yes. I'm ready. Grace nodded. Good, because the real fight is just beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Sophie improved slowly. Color returned to her cheeks. Her appetite came back. The stomach pain that had plagued her for months finally subsided as the poison worked its way out of her system. But the psychological wounds were harder to heal. She woke screaming from nightmares she couldn't explain, crying for her mother, her real mother, the one who'd died 3 years ago, and left her alone in a world that had proven itself cruel beyond imagination. Grace stayed by her side through all of it. She slept in the hospital chair, ate cafeteria food, showered in the staff locker room when one of the nurses took pity on her. She read Sophie stories, held her hand during blood draws, sang lullabies in Spanish when the nightmares came. And every day, she watched the little girl fight her way back from the edge of death. Richard was there too, more present than he'd been in months, maybe years. The guilt ate at him, visibly carving new lines into his face, putting gray in his hair that hadn't been there before. He took a leave of absence from his company. He canceled meetings, ignored calls, delegated everything that could be delegated. For the first time since his wife died, Richard Anderson put his daughter first. But he couldn't escape what was coming. 3 weeks after Charlotte's arrest, the district attorney called. Mr. Anderson, I wanted to inform you personally. We're moving forward with charges. Attempted murder in the 1st degree, child endangerment, assault with a deadly weapon. The DA's voice was crisp, professional. Given the evidence, we're confident we can secure a conviction. Richard sat in the hospital corridor, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gripping the armrest until his knuckles turned white. What do you need from me? Your testimony, and Ms. Williams's testimony. You'll both be called as witnesses for the prosecution. And Sophie. We'll do everything we can to keep her off the stand. Given her age and what she's been through, the judge should grant an exemption. But I have to be honest with you, the defense will fight it. Richard's jaw tightened. Charlotte's defense? She's hired Edward Blackwell. The name hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Edward Blackwell was the most expensive criminal defense attorney in California. He'd gotten CEOs off for fraud, politicians off for corruption, a movie producer off for a crime that had made national headlines. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly without conscience. How is she paying for him? We're not sure. She had significant assets hidden under various aliases. We're still untangling the web. The DA paused. Mr. Anderson, I have to warn you. Blackwell's strategy in cases like this is always the same. Attack the witnesses, destroy their credibility, make the jury question everything they thought they knew. You're saying he'll go after Grace? Yes, and you. He'll try to paint Ms. Williams as a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. He'll argue she tampered with the evidence. He'll claim you and she conspired to frame Charlotte because... The DA hesitated. Because what? Because you were having an affair. Because you wanted Charlotte out of the picture so you could be with Ms. Williams. Richard's vision went red. That's a lie. I know. But Blackwell doesn't care about truth. He cares about reasonable doubt. And if he can make even one juror believe there's another explanation for what happened, Charlotte walks free. Richard ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment staring at the wall. Then he got up and walked to Sophie's room. Grace was sitting by the bed reading aloud from a picture book while Sophie dozed. She looked up when Richard entered, saw his face, and set the book aside. What happened? Richard closed the door behind him. They're going to trial, and Charlotte's lawyer is going to try to destroy you. Grace didn't flinch. Let him try. Grace, you don't understand. Edward Blackwell is... I know who he is. Grace stood, her voice quiet but firm. I've seen his type my whole life. Men who think they can twist the truth until it breaks. Men who think people like me don't matter, that our word isn't worth anything, that we can be pushed around and silenced and forgotten. She met Richard's eyes. I didn't back down from Charlotte. I'm not backing down from her lawyer. Richard stared at her. He's going to make it personal. He's going to dig into your past, your family, your immigration status, anything he can find. He's going to make you look like a liar, a criminal, a woman who'd do anything for money. I've been called worse. Grace. Mr. Anderson. Richard, listen to me. Grace stepped closer. That little girl in that bed almost died. Charlotte Hayes put poison in her juice box every morning and watched her suffer and pretended to care. She was going to keep doing it until Sophie was dead and she had your money. I'm not going to let some fancy lawyer scare me into silence. I'm not going to let Charlotte get away with this. Not now. Not ever. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Okay. Then we fight. We fight. The trial began on a Tuesday in March. Grace had never been inside a courthouse before. She'd seen them in movies, on TV shows, and news reports about cases that had nothing to do with her life. But walking through those heavy wooden doors, feeling the weight of history and judgment pressing down on her shoulders, she understood why people feared this place. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery, cameras flashing, despite the judge's orders. Richard's name was too big, the crime too sensational, the story too perfect for the media to ignore. Billionaire's fiancé accused of poisoning his daughter. The headlines wrote themselves. Grace sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution's table. Richard sat beside her, his hand brushing against hers, not holding it, not quite, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. A reminder that she wasn't alone. Charlotte was led in by two bailiffs. Grace hadn't seen her since the arrest. The woman who entered the courtroom now was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the designer athleisure, the perfect ponytail, the magazine cover smile. Charlotte wore a simple gray suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a modest bun, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She looked smaller somehow, softer, like a woman wrongly accused, a victim of circumstance, rather than a cold-blooded would-be murderer. It was a performance. Grace knew it instantly, and she knew the jury might not. Charlotte took her seat at the defense table beside Edward Blackwell, a silver-haired man in a suit that probably cost more than Grace's car. He whispered something in Charlotte's ear. She nodded, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The judge entered. Everyone rose. "Be seated." The trial of Charlotte Hayes, also known as Veronica Lawson, also known as Victoria Crane, also known as Catherine Wells, had begun. The prosecution's case was methodical, devastating. The district attorney walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece. The video of Charlotte injecting poison into Sophie's juice box. The laboratory analysis from UC Berkeley confirming ethylene glycol in multiple samples. The medical records showing Sophie's symptoms, the damage to her kidneys, the slow deterioration that would have ended in death if Grace hadn't intervened. Then came the laptop. The defendant's personal computer contained search history dating back 18 months. The DA said, displaying screenshots on the courtroom monitors. How much antifreeze to kill a child? Symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning. How long until kidney failure in children? How to avoid detection when poisoning someone. The jury shifted uncomfortably. One woman covered her mouth. The searches began 2 months before the defendant even met Richard Anderson. She was planning this crime before she ever walked into that charity gala. Before she ever smiled at Mr. Anderson across a crowded room. Before she ever called Sophie sweetheart or princess or promised to be the mother that little girl so desperately needed. Charlotte sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Only her hands betrayed her gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. The prosecution calls Grace Williams to the stand. Grace rose. Her legs felt like water. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure the entire courtroom could hear it. But she walked forward, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The DA approached with a reassuring nod. "Ms. Williams, how long have you worked for the Anderson family?" 3 years. "And in that time, what was your relationship with Sophie Anderson?" "I took care of her. Made her meals, helped with homework, put her to bed at night. Her mother died when she was 2. I tried to fill some of that gap." "Did you love her?" Grace's voice caught. "Yes. I love her like she was my own." Can you describe Sophie's health before Charlotte Hayes entered the household? She was a healthy little girl, full of energy, laughing all the time, never sick, hardly ever even got a cold. And after Ms. Hayes became engaged to Mr. Anderson, Sophie started getting sick. Stomach pain, vomiting, fatigue. At first we thought it was a virus, but it didn't go away. It just got worse and worse. What made you suspect something was wrong? Grace took a breath. The juice boxes. Charlotte insisted on buying them from a special store. Wouldn't let anyone else pick them up. And Sophie always got sicker after drinking them. She paused. One morning I found a half-empty juice box in Sophie's room. It smelled wrong, metallic. I saved it, gave it to my nephew to test. And the results? Ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. Continue, Ms. Williams. I knew I needed more evidence, so I set up a hidden camera in the kitchen. And that morning, I watched Charlotte take a syringe from her purse and inject poison directly into Sophie's juice box. What did you do then? I called the police. The DA nodded. Thank you, Ms. Williams. No further questions. Edward Blackwell rose slowly from his chair. He buttoned his jacket, straightened his tie, and approached the witness stand with the casual confidence of a predator who knew his prey was cornered. Ms. Williams, may I call you Grace? If you want. Grace. He smiled, all warmth and friendliness. You've worked as a housekeeper for over 20 years. Is that correct? Yes. And before the Anderson family, you worked for other wealthy families in the Bay Area. Yes. Were you ever let go from any of those positions? Grace hesitated. Once. Just once. Can you tell us about that? The DA stood. Objection. Relevance. Goes to witness credibility, Your Honor. The judge considered. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Ms. Williams. Grace's jaw tightened. I worked for a family in Palo Alto. They accused me of stealing jewelry. They fired me without investigation. Were charges filed? No, because I didn't steal anything. The daughter later admitted she'd pawned the jewelry herself to buy drugs. Blackwell nodded, his expression sympathetic. That must have been very painful. Being accused of something you didn't do. It was. It must have made you angry. I got over it. Did you? Blackwell took a step closer. Because I wonder, Grace, if perhaps you have a history of resentment toward your employers, toward people with money and power who treat you like you're invisible. Objection. Withdrawn. Blackwell held up his hands. Let me ask you something else, Grace. You said you found a juice box that smelled wrong, but you're not a scientist, are you? No. You're not a doctor. You're not a toxicologist. You're not trained in any kind of chemical analysis. No. So when you say the juice box smelled metallic, you're just guessing. You have no actual knowledge of what ethylene glycol smells like. My nephew tested it. He's a chemistry student at Berkeley. Ah, yes. Your nephew. Blackwell turned to face the jury. Your nephew, who conducted these tests in his university lab without any official oversight, without any chain of custody documentation, without any way to verify that the samples you gave him hadn't been tampered with. I didn't tamper with anything. So you say. Blackwell spun back to face her. But here's what I find interesting, Grace. You claim you suspected my client for weeks before you gathered evidence. You claim you set up a hidden camera to catch her in the act. But you never once went to your employer, Richard Anderson, with your concerns. Why not? Grace's voice hardened. I tried. He didn't believe me. He didn't believe you. Or maybe you never really told him, because you knew your suspicions were baseless. They weren't baseless. You saw a woman preparing breakfast for her future stepdaughter. You saw a woman who cared about that child's nutrition. You saw a woman who was about to marry a billionaire and become mistress of a house you'd been running for 3 years. Blackwell's voice rose. And you saw an opportunity. That's not true, isn't it? Let me paint a picture for the jury, Grace. You're a 53-year-old housekeeper. You've worked for rich people your whole life, watched them live in luxury while you scrubbed their toilets and washed their dishes. Then Charlotte Hayes comes along, young, beautiful, about to become Mrs. Richard Anderson, and suddenly your position is threatened. I wasn't threatened by her. Charlotte told you there would be changes when she became Richard's wife. She told you the household staff would be streamlined. She told you in so many words that your job was on the line. Grace said nothing. So you decided to get rid of her first. Blackwell's voice dropped to something almost gentle. You contaminated those juice boxes yourself. You planted the evidence. You set up that camera to frame an innocent woman for a crime she didn't commit. That is a lie. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, Grace, you had motive, you had opportunity, and you had access to everything needed to frame my client. Grace leaned forward, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. I watched that woman inject poison into a child's drink. I watched her try to murder a 5-year-old girl for money. I have video evidence that you created, that you controlled, that no one else can verify. The police verified it. The prosecutors verified it. Everyone who watched that video saw exactly what I saw. They saw what you wanted them to see. Blackwell turned to the jury, spreading his hands. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case built on the word of a woman with a grudge, supported by evidence that she herself collected, tested by her own family member, in a situation where she stood to gain everything by removing my client from the picture. He looked at Grace one last time. No further questions. Grace stepped down from the stand, her legs barely holding her. Richard was on his feet the moment she reached the gallery. He guided her to her seat, his hand steady on her arm, his face dark with fury. He twisted everything, Grace whispered. I know. He made it sound like I know. Richard's voice was firm. But the jury saw the video. They heard the evidence. They know what Charlotte did. Do they? Grace looked at the jury box at the 12 faces that would decide Charlotte's fate, and maybe hers too. Because right now they're looking at me like I'm the one on trial. The next 3 days were brutal. Blackwell called witness after witness, former colleagues from Charlotte's pharmaceutical days, who testified to her kindness, her professionalism, her dedication to her patients. He called a psychologist who claimed Charlotte showed no signs of sociopathy or violent tendencies. He called a handwriting expert who questioned the authenticity of Charlotte's laptop search history. And then he put Charlotte on the stand. She wept. She wept as she described meeting Richard at the charity gala. She wept as she talked about falling in love with Sophie, about wanting to be the mother the little girl so desperately needed. She wept as she denied ever hurting anyone, as she claimed she'd been framed by a jealous employee who couldn't stand seeing someone else take care of her child. "I loved Sophie," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. "I would never hurt her. Never." "Then how do you explain the video, Ms. Hayes?" "I don't know." Charlotte dabbed at her eyes. "I've watched it 100 times. I don't understand. The woman in that video looks like me, moves like me, but I swear on my life it isn't me. It can't be." "Are you saying the video was fabricated?" "I'm saying I don't know what happened. But I know I'm innocent. I know I never touched those juice boxes. I know I never hurt that little girl." Grace watched from the gallery, her hands clenched into fists. It was a masterful performance. Charlotte hit every note, the trembling voice, the glistening eyes, the raw vulnerability of a woman wrongly accused. If Grace hadn't seen the truth with her own eyes, she might have believed it herself. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, methodical, devastating. They walked Charlotte through every piece of evidence, forced her to explain the laptop searches, the hidden syringe, the multiple aliases. "Your real name isn't Charlotte Hayes, is it?" Charlotte hesitated. "No." "What is your real name?" "Veronica Lawson." "And before that, when you lived in Texas and married a wealthy oil executive who died 6 months later under mysterious circumstances." Charlotte's mask slipped just for a second. "That has nothing to do with this case." "Doesn't it?" "Because the woman who married James Whitmore in 2019 was named Victoria Crane, and the woman who dated a tech entrepreneur in Seattle before he reported jewelry worth $500,000 stolen was named Catherine Wells." The prosecutor stepped closer. "How many names do you have, Ms. Lawson? How many identities have you created to get close to wealthy men and take what you want?" "I've made mistakes. I've run from my past. But I never killed anyone. James Whitmore died of heart failure 6 months after you married him. He was 42 years old and in perfect health. That was natural causes. The medical examiner confirmed it. The medical examiner in a small Texas county where you happen to be very generous with your new husband's money." The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're not dealing with a woman who made one desperate mistake. We're dealing with a predator, a con artist, a woman who has spent over a decade targeting wealthy men, ingratiating herself into their lives, and taking everything they have, including, when necessary, their children's lives." Charlotte's composure shattered. "That's not true. None of that is true. I loved Richard. I loved Sophie. I would never. You would never. What, Ms. Lawson? Never poison a 5-year-old girl for a $200 million trust fund. Never inject antifreeze into a juice box and watch her suffer for weeks while pretending to be concerned. Never plan your wedding while planning her murder." "I didn't do it." Charlotte was screaming now, her face red, her carefully constructed mask torn completely away. "I didn't do it. She did. That woman." She pointed at Grace, her finger shaking with rage. "She planted everything. She's been obsessed with Sophie since the day I arrived. She couldn't stand watching someone else be a mother to that girl. She set me up. She framed me." The judge banged his gavel. "Ms. Lawson, control yourself. They're going to send me to prison for something I didn't do, all because some jealous housekeeper couldn't accept that Richard chose me. Can't you see what's happening? Can't you see she's lying? The bailiffs moved forward. Charlotte struggled against them, still screaming. I'm innocent. I'm innocent. You're all going to realize you made a terrible mistake. They dragged her from the courtroom. The judge called a recess. Grace sat frozen in her seat. Charlotte's screams still echoing in her ears. Richard turned to her, his face pale. Grace, are you okay? She's not going to stop. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Even if they convict her, even if she goes to prison, she's going to spend the rest of her life claiming she was framed, claiming I'm the monster. No one believes her. Some people will. Grace looked at the jury box, empty now, as the jurors deliberated in a room somewhere deep in the courthouse. Some people always believe the pretty white woman over the black housekeeper. That's how the world works. Richard took her hand. Not this time. Not if I have anything to say about it. The jury was out for 6 hours. Grace spent most of that time in a small conference room with Richard and the prosecutors, drinking bad coffee and trying not to stare at the clock. Every minute felt like an hour. Every hour felt like a day. Finally, the call came. The juries reached a verdict. They filed back into the courtroom. Charlotte was led in, her face composed again, her mask back in place. She looked at Grace as she took her seat, a long, cold stare that promised retribution. Grace didn't look away. The judge turned to the jury. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find? The foreman looked at Charlotte. Guilty. Grace's breath caught. On the charge of child endangerment, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes exploded. Charlotte screamed something that was swallowed by the chaos. But Grace heard none of it. She was crying. Silent tears streaming down her face as Richard pulled her into an embrace. It's over, he whispered. It's over. Grace shook her head against his chest. Not yet. Not until she's sentenced. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Charlotte stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair lank and unwashed, her face stripped of all pretense. She looked like what she was, a predator who'd finally been caught. The judge's voice was ice. Ms. Lawson, you systematically poisoned a 5-year-old child for financial gain. You manipulated her father, betrayed his trust, and would have murdered his daughter if not for the courage of one woman who refused to stay silent. He leaned forward. Your protests of innocence are as hollow as your remorse. Your attempts to blame Ms. Williams for your crimes are as despicable as the crimes themselves. This court has heard your lies. This court has seen your manipulation. And this court will not be fooled. Charlotte said nothing. Her face was blank, empty. For the crime of attempted murder in the first degree, I sentence you to 30 years in state prison. For child endangerment, 10 years to run concurrently. For assault with a deadly weapon, 5 years to run concurrently. You will not be eligible for parole for 25 years. The judge banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. As the bailiffs led her away, Charlotte turned one last time. She looked at Grace. Not with hatred this time, not with rage, with something worse. Recognition. One predator acknowledging another. Then she was gone. Grace sat in the empty courtroom for a long time after everyone else had left. Richard found her there, staring at the chair where Charlotte had sat. Grace, she's going to appeal. Let her. The evidence is overwhelming. She's going to spend the next 25 years telling anyone who'll listen that I framed her, that I'm the real monster. Richard sat down beside her. Does that matter? Grace thought about it. Really thought. No, she said finally. I guess it doesn't. Sophie's alive because of you. That's what matters. That's the only thing that matters. Grace nodded slowly. Take me to her. Always. They drove to the hospital in silence. Sophie was waiting sitting up in bed for the first time in days, a picture book open in her lap. She looked up when Grace walked through the door, and her face split into the first real smile Grace had seen in months. "Grace, Daddy said you were coming. He said the bad lady is going away forever." Grace crossed the room and pulled Sophie into her arms. "That's right, baby. She's going away, and she's never going to hurt you again." Sophie hugged her back, her small arms tight around Grace's neck. "I knew you'd save me," she whispered. "I always knew." Grace held her tighter and let the tears come. Sophie came home 3 weeks after the sentencing. Grace had spent the day before preparing her room washing sheets, arranging stuffed animals, making everything perfect for the little girl who'd spent too long in hospital beds, surrounded by beeping machines and sterile walls. She'd baked Sophie's favorite cookies, chocolate chip with extra chocolate chips, and put fresh flowers on the nightstand. But when Richard carried Sophie through the front door, the child froze. Her eyes went wide. Her body went rigid. She looked around the foyer like she was seeing ghosts. "Sophie." Richard's voice was gentle. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "This is where she lived." Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "Charlotte. She walked down those stairs every morning. She stood right there." Grace felt her heart crack. She hadn't thought about that, hadn't considered what it would mean for Sophie to come back to a house where her almost murderer had eaten breakfast, watched television, kissed her father goodnight. Richard looked at Grace, helpless. Grace stepped forward and knelt in front of Sophie. "You know what I did while you were in the hospital, baby." Sophie shook her head. "I cleaned every inch of this house. I threw away everything Charlotte ever touched. Her clothes, her makeup, her books, all gone. And then I opened every window and let the sunshine in." Grace took Sophie's hands. "This isn't her house anymore. It's your house. Yours and your daddy's. And mine if you'll let me stay." Sophie's lip trembled. "She's really never coming back. Never. She's in prison, baby, behind big walls and locked doors. She can't hurt you ever again." "Promise?" "I promise. And you know I always keep my promises." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at Richard. "Daddy, can Grace stay forever?" Richard's eyes met Grace's over Sophie's head. "If she wants to," he said softly. "She can stay as long as she wants." Grace blinked back tears. "I'm not going anywhere, mi amor. Not ever." Sophie reached for Grace, and Grace lifted her into her arms. The child buried her face in Grace's shoulder. "I want to see my room now. Can we go see my room?" "Of course, baby. Let's go see your room." Grace carried her up the stairs, past the spot where Charlotte used to stand, and smile her perfect smile, past the hallway where Grace had hidden, and watched a monster poison a child's drink. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the little girl in her arms. The little girl who was alive. The little girl who was home. The first weeks were hard. Sophie had nightmares almost every night. She'd wake screaming, crying for Grace, crying for her daddy, crying for a mother she barely remembered but still missed with every fiber of her being. Grace would rush to her room and hold her until the shaking stopped, until the tears dried, until sleep finally reclaimed her. "Why did she want to hurt me?" Sophie asked one night, her voice small in the darkness. "What did I do wrong?" Grace's heart shattered for the 100th time. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. Not one single thing." "Then why? How do you explain evil to a child? How do you make sense of something that doesn't make sense?" "Some people are sick inside," Grace said carefully. "Not sick like you were sick, sick in their hearts. They don't feel love the way we do. They don't understand that hurting people is wrong. Charlotte was one of those people." "Was she always like that?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. Or maybe something happened to her a long time ago that broke something inside her. That's sad." Grace blinked. "What?" "It's sad. That she was broken. That she couldn't feel love." Sophie looked up at Grace with those wide, innocent eyes. "I feel bad for her." Grace didn't know what to say. After everything Charlotte had done, the weeks of poison, the months of manipulation, the years of prison that lay ahead, this child still found it in her heart to feel compassion. "You have a beautiful soul, baby," Grace whispered. "Don't ever let anyone take that from you." Sophie nestled closer. "Grace? Yes? I love you more than chocolate chip cookies." Despite everything, Grace laughed. "I love you more than chocolate chip cookies, too." Richard knocked on the doorframe. "Room for one more?" Sophie held out her arms. "Daddy." Richard crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, gathering Sophie against his chest. Grace started to rise to give them privacy, but Sophie grabbed her hand. "Don't go. Stay." So Grace stayed. The three of them sat there in the darkness, Sophie between them, her small hands holding onto both of them like anchors in a storm. "I was thinking," Richard said softly, "maybe we should take a trip, the three of us. Go somewhere new, somewhere with no bad memories." "Where?" Sophie asked. "I don't know. Where do you want to go?" Sophie thought about it. "The beach. Mommy always said she'd take me to the beach." Richard's breath caught. He looked at Grace over Sophie's head. "Then the beach it is," he said quietly. "We'll find the most beautiful beach in the world." "Can Grace come?" "Of course Grace is coming. And we can build sandcastles. The biggest sandcastles you've ever seen." Sophie smiled a real smile, the first one Grace had seen since before the hospital. "Okay, I'd like that." She fell asleep between them, her breathing finally, even her face finally peaceful. Richard didn't move. Neither did Grace. "Thank you," Richard whispered. "For what?" "For everything. For saving her. For staying. For being here when I couldn't be what she needed. You're exactly what she needs." "No." Richard shook his head. "I'm learning. But you knew how to love her from the first day. You knew how to protect her when I was too blind to see the danger. You're the reason she's alive." Grace looked at Sophie's sleeping face. "I just did what anyone would have done." "Stop saying that." Richard's voice was firm. "Stop pretending what you did was ordinary. It wasn't. Most people would have looked the other way. Most people would have told themselves it wasn't their problem. You risked everything, your job, your safety, your future for a child who wasn't even yours." "She is mine." The words came out before Grace could stop them. "Maybe not by blood, maybe not by law, but she's mine. She's been mine since the day her mother died, and I held her while she cried." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. "I've known for a long time. That's why I need you to stay. Not as an employee. Not as a favor. As family." Grace met his eyes. "Family. If you'll have us." Grace looked at Sophie, at this child she'd loved and protected and nearly lost. Then she looked at Richard, at this man who'd been broken by grief and betrayed by love and was somehow still standing. "I'll have you," she said softly. "Both of you. For as long as you want me." Richard reached across Sophie's sleeping body and took Grace's hand. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. The media wouldn't leave them alone. Every day brought new reporters to the gates, new camera crews setting up on the sidewalk, new requests for interviews and exclusive stories and the real truth about what happened in the Anderson mansion. Richard ignored them all, but the stories kept coming. Articles about Charlotte's other victims, the Texas oil executive who'd died mysteriously, the Seattle entrepreneur who'd lost $500,000 in jewelry, the other men she'd targeted over the years. Some of them came forward publicly. Others sent private messages of thanks to Grace telling her she'd stopped a monster who'd ruined their lives. Then, the hate mail started. Not for Charlotte. For Grace. "I saw it on the news," Grace told Richard one evening, her hands shaking as she held a stack of letters. "They're saying I framed her. They're saying I manipulated the evidence. They're saying—" She couldn't finish. Richard took the letters from her hands. "Don't read these. How can I not? They're saying I'm a liar. They're saying I should be in prison instead of her. They're wrong. Are they? Grace's voice cracked. Because every time I close my eyes, I see that courtroom. I see the jury looking at me like I was the criminal. I see Charlotte pointing at me and screaming, "Grace." Richard put his hands on her shoulders. "Look at me." She looked. "You saved my daughter's life." The jury found Charlotte guilty unanimously. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge called you courageous. He squeezed her shoulders. "You are not the villain of this story. You're the hero. And I don't care how many idiots on the internet say otherwise." But what if Sophie sees it? What if she grows up and reads these articles and starts to wonder? She won't wonder, because she knows the truth. She knows you saved her. She knows you love her. Richard's voice softened. "And she knows I love you." Grace went still. "What?" Richard's face flushed. "I didn't mean I wasn't going to." He took a breath. "It's too soon. I know it's too soon. Charlotte's only been gone a few months, and you're still processing everything, and the last thing you need is me complicating things." "Richard." He stopped. "Say it again." He met her eyes. "I love you. I've loved you for longer than I want to admit. Maybe since the day you sat with Sophie when she had that fever, and I came home to find you singing to her in Spanish. Maybe since the day you told me Charlotte wasn't right for us, and I was too stupid to listen." He paused. "Maybe since the day you risked everything to save my daughter and asked for nothing in return." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm the help, Richard. I clean your house. I cook your meals. Your family." His voice was fierce. "You're the woman who raised my daughter when I was too lost in grief to see straight. You're the woman who saw a monster when everyone else saw a saint. You're the bravest person I've ever known. I'm nobody special. You're everything special." Richard stepped closer. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not expecting anything. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, I love you. And that's not going to change." Grace stood there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. The power imbalance, the optics, the people who would assume she'd planned this all along, that she'd gotten rid of Charlotte so she could take her place. Then she thought about Sophie, who loved them both. About the nights they'd spent talking after Sophie fell asleep, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. About the way Richard looked at her. Not like a servant, not like an employee, but like an equal, like a partner, like someone worth loving. "I can't promise anything," she said slowly. "I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. There's so much I know. People will talk. They'll say I manipulated you. They'll say I seduced you for your money. They'll say, I don't care what they say. I do." Grace's voice hardened. "Because I've spent my whole life being judged by people who don't know me, being dismissed, being overlooked, and I can't stand the thought of proving them right." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Then we go slow," he said finally. "We take our time. We figure this out together without anyone else's input. No announcements, no pressure, just us." "And Sophie?" "Sophie already thinks you hung the moon. Whatever we decide, she'll be happy as long as you're here." Grace wiped her eyes. "You really love me. More than I've ever loved anyone except Sophie. Even though Don't." Richard's voice sharpened. "Don't finish that sentence. I don't care what color your skin is. I don't care where you come from. I don't care what anyone else thinks we should or shouldn't be. I care about you, the person you are, the heart you have, the way you love my daughter like she's your own." Grace took a shaky breath. "Okay. Okay. Okay, we go slow. We figure this out together. We see where this goes." Richard's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I haven't promised anything." "You promised to try. That's enough." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Grace let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future worth hoping for. Dr. Chen's office was warm and inviting, filled with soft furniture and colorful artwork designed to put children at ease. Sophie sat on a beanbag chair, clutching her stuffed bunny, while the therapist, a gentle woman with kind eyes and an even kinder voice, sat across from her. Grace waited in the lobby, her knee bouncing with nervous energy. Richard had insisted Sophie see someone. The nightmares weren't getting better. The fear of being alone hadn't faded. And some mornings, Sophie would refuse to eat or drink anything unless Grace or Richard had tasted it first. An hour later, the office door opened. Sophie ran out and grabbed Grace's hand. "I talked about Charlotte. Dr. Chen says it's okay to feel scared and angry at the same time." "That's right, baby." Dr. Chen emerged behind her, gesturing for Grace to step aside. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" They moved to a quiet corner while Sophie sat in the waiting area flipping through a picture book. "She's processing remarkably well," Dr. Chen said. "Better than I expected, honestly. She has a strong attachment to you, talks about you constantly. Grace saved me. Grace keeps me safe. Grace loves me more than chocolate chip cookies." Grace smiled despite herself. "But there are some concerns." Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "She's developed a fear of abandonment that's manifesting in interesting ways. She asked me today if you were going to leave once she got better. She seems to believe your presence is contingent on her needing protection." Grace's chest tightened. "I would never leave her." "I know, but she needs to hear it. Not once, over and over until she believes it. Children who've experienced trauma often test the people they love. They push, they provoke, they act out all to see if you'll stay anyway." "I will, no matter what." "Then keep showing her. Keep proving it. The words matter, but the actions matter more." Dr. Chen paused. "There's something else." "What?" Sophie asked about her mother today. Her biological mother. She wanted to know if her mother would have protected her the way you did. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that her mother loved her very much and that sometimes people show love in different ways. But I think she needs to hear more about her mother, from someone who knew her." Dr. Chen looked at Grace directly. "Do you know anything about Sophie's mother?" "A little. I started working for the family a year after she died. But Richard, he has pictures, videos, stories. He just doesn't talk about her. It hurts too much." "It might be time for that to change. Sophie's constructing her identity right now, figuring out who she is and where she comes from. She needs to know about the mother who gave birth to her, not as a replacement for you, but as part of her story." Grace nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Richard." She found him in his study that evening, staring at a photograph on his desk. Sophie's mother, a beautiful woman with Sophie's dark hair and bright smile, laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. "She was happy that day," Richard said without looking up. "We'd just found out she was pregnant. I made some terrible joke about hoping the baby got her looks, and she laughed so hard she cried." Grace sat down across from him. "Dr. Chen thinks Sophie needs to know more about her." Richard's jaw tightened. "I've tried. Every time I start to talk about her, I can't." His voice broke. "It feels like ripping open a wound that never healed." "I know. But Sophie needs her story. All of it. The mother who wanted her, who loved her before she was even born. Not just the woman who tried to take her place." Richard looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Her name was Emily. Did you know that I don't think I've ever told you?" "No, you never talked about her." "She was a teacher, 2nd grade. She loved those kids like they were her own." Richard smiled sadly. "When she got pregnant with Sophie, she used to read to her belly every night. Books about princesses and adventures and brave little girls who saved the world." "Sophie would love to hear that." "I know, Richard set down the photograph. "I was so angry when Emily died. Angry at the drunk driver who killed her. Angry at God for taking her. Angry at myself for not being able to protect her. And then Charlotte came along, and she was so good at pretending to care, and I thought maybe—" He stopped shaking his head. "I thought maybe I could skip the grieving. Just find someone new and move on like nothing happened. That's not how grief works." "No, it's not." Richard looked at Grace. "I buried my wife and never dealt with it. I let a monster into my home because I was too broken to see clearly. And Sophie paid the price." "Richard, don't tell me it wasn't my fault. I know it was. Charlotte fooled me because I wanted to be fooled. Because facing the truth about Emily, about how much I lost, about how much Sophie lost, was too painful to bear." Grace reached across the desk and took his hand. "Then face it now. Not alone. With me. With Sophie. Tell her about her mother. Cry with her. Grieve with her. Let her know that Emily was real and loved her, and would have been so proud of the brave little girl she's become." Richard squeezed her hand. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Know exactly what to say. Exactly what I need to hear." "I don't always, but I try." Grace smiled softly. "That's all any of us can do." Richard stood still, holding her hand. "Will you come with me when I talk to Sophie about Emily?" "Of course." They found Sophie in her room, arranging her stuffed animals in a circle for what appeared to be a very important tea party. "Daddy, Grace, you can be guests. But you have to pretend the tea is real." Richard knelt beside her. "Actually, sweetheart, I wanted to talk to you about something first. Something important." Sophie's face grew serious. She set down her toy teacup. "Is it bad?" "No, baby, not bad. Just big." He pulled a photograph from his pocket, the one from his desk, the one of Emily laughing. "Do you know who this is?" Sophie took the photograph carefully, studying it with the intense concentration only children possess. "She looks like me." "She does, because she's your mommy, your real mommy, the one who had you in her tummy and loved you before you were even born." Sophie traced the woman's face with her finger. "What was she like?" Richard sat down on the floor beside her, and Grace settled nearby, close enough to offer support, but far enough to give them space. "She was wonderful," Richard said quietly. "She was a teacher. She loved helping kids learn to read. And she loved you so much, Sophie. She used to read to you every night when you were still in her tummy. Books about princesses and adventures and brave little girls. Like me. Exactly like you." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Did she have to go away?" Richard's eyes glistened. "Yes, baby. There was an accident. A car accident. And Mommy got hurt very badly, and the doctors couldn't fix her." "Did it hurt?" "No, sweetheart. It happened very fast. She didn't feel any pain." Sophie looked at the photograph again. "Does she know about Charlotte, about what happened to me?" Richard hesitated. Grace reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. "I think," Grace said gently, "that wherever your mommy is, she's watching over you. And I think she's very proud of how brave you've been." "You think so?" "I know so." Sophie held the photograph against her chest. "Can I keep this in my room?" "Of course, baby." Richard's voice was thick with tears. "You can have any picture of Mommy you want. I have lots of them. Whenever you want to see her, whenever you want to know more about her, you just ask." "Okay." Sophie nodded. Then she looked at Grace. "Grace." "Yes, sweetheart. I have 2 mommies now, the one in heaven and you." Sophie's eyes were clear, certain. "Is that okay?" Grace's heart cracked wide open. She pulled Sophie into her arms, holding her tight, feeling Richard's hand on her back, feeling the 3 of them connected in a way that transcended blood and law, and everything the world said family was supposed to be. "That's more than okay, baby," Grace whispered. "That's perfect." The beach house was perfect. Richard had found it on the coast of Carmel, a small private cottage overlooking the Pacific, far from reporters and cameras and anyone who might recognize them. For 1 week, they could just be a family. No titles, no history. Just three people who loved each other building sandcastles and collecting shells and pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. Sophie ran across the sand shrieking with laughter as the waves chased her feet. "Grace, Daddy, come on!" Grace kicked off her sandals and followed the cold water, shocking her toes. Richard was right behind her, rolling up his pants like a man who'd never been to a beach before. "You look ridiculous." Grace laughed. "I'm a tech CEO. I'm supposed to look ridiculous at the beach." Sophie grabbed both their hands, pulling them toward the shoreline. "We have to jump the waves. That's the rule." "What rule?" "The beach rule. I just made it up." They jumped waves until they were all soaked and breathless, collapsing onto the sand in a pile of wet clothes and sandy limbs. Sophie lay between them, staring up at the sky. "This is the best day ever." "Better than Christmas?" Richard asked. "Better than Christmas. Better than your birthday. Better than everything." Sophie rolled over to look at them both. "Can we stay here forever? Just us?" Grace brushed sand from Sophie's cheek. "We can't stay forever, baby, but we can come back whenever you want." "Promise. Promise." Sophie seemed satisfied with that. She closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face. Richard reached over and took Grace's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For giving her this. For giving us this." "You found the beach house." "That's not what I mean." Richard propped himself up on one elbow, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You gave us a future. When Charlotte was poisoning Sophie, when I was too blind to see, you were the one who fought. You gave Sophie a chance to grow up, to have days like this, to jump waves and build sandcastles and laugh like a kid is supposed to laugh." Grace looked at Sophie, peaceful and happy in the sunshine. "She deserves it. She deserves all of it. So do you." Grace turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "I mean you deserve happiness too. You've spent your whole life taking care of other people, your family, your employers, other people's children. When was the last time someone took care of you?" Grace didn't have an answer. "Let me take care of you," Richard said softly. "Let me show you what it feels like to be loved without having to earn it, without having to prove yourself, without having to fight." "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I, but we can learn together." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than an answer. When they pulled apart, Sophie was watching them with a huge grin on her face. "I saw that." Grace's face flushed. "Sophie, you kissed on the lips." Sophie clapped her hands. "Does this mean Grace is going to be my other mommy for real?" Richard looked at Grace. "That's up to Grace." Grace looked at this man and this child, this family that had chosen her, that wanted her, that loved her not for what she could do for them, but for who she was. She thought about all the years she'd spent invisible, all the wealthy families who'd looked right through her, all the times she'd been dismissed, overlooked, forgotten. And then she thought about Sophie, who called her a hero, about Richard, who called her family, about the life they were offering her, not as charity, not as obligation, but as equals. "I think," Grace said slowly, "I'd like that very much." Sophie threw herself at Grace, nearly knocking her back into the sand. "Best day ever." Richard laughed a real laugh, deep and full and free. And Grace, holding a child who loved her and looking at a man who wanted her, finally let herself believe that maybe she deserved this after all. Maybe she always had. 1 year passed, then 2. The nightmares faded slowly like bruises healing beneath the skin. Sophie still woke, sometimes heart racing, certain she heard footsteps on the stairs. But instead of screaming, she would pad down the hallway to the room where Grace slept, the master bedroom, now the one she shared with Richard, and crawl into the space between them. "Bad dream," she would whisper, and Grace would pull her close, and Richard would drape an arm over both of them, and Sophie would fall back asleep knowing she was safe. The wedding was small, private. Just family and a handful of close friends gathered in the backyard of the Pacific Heights mansion under an arch of white roses that Sophie had helped arrange. Grace wore a simple ivory dress. No designer labels. No $1,000 shoes. Just something that made her feel beautiful. Something that felt like her. Sophie was the flower girl, of course. She took her responsibilities very seriously, scattering petals with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of a child who'd been promised extra cake if she did a good job. Richard waited at the altar, looking at Grace like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. "You ready?" Marcus asked, standing beside her. He'd agreed to walk her down the aisle, her nephew, her rock, the young man who'd tested those juice boxes and helped save a little girl's life. "I think so." "You think so?" Marcus grinned. "Tia, you faced down a murderer. You survived a trial. You helped put a monster in prison. You really nervous about saying, 'I do'?" Grace laughed despite herself. "Fair point. That's what I thought." Marcus offered his arm. "Now let's go. Your family's waiting." They walked down the aisle together past the roses and the smiling faces, past the spot where Charlotte had once stood and schemed and planned a child's murder. None of that existed anymore. It had been erased by love, by courage, by the stubborn refusal to let evil win. Richard took Grace's hands as she reached the altar. "Hi," he whispered. "Hi. You look beautiful. You look terrified." He laughed. "I am, but in a good way." The officiant began the ceremony, but Grace barely heard the words. She was too busy looking at Richard. This man who'd been broken and rebuilt, who'd learned to trust again, who'd chosen her not despite her past, but because of who that past had made her. And she was too busy looking at Sophie standing off to the side with her basket of petals beaming so hard it seemed like her face might crack. "Do you, Grace Williams, take Richard Anderson to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "And do you, Richard Anderson, take Grace Williams to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Richard pulled her close and kissed her, and the small crowd erupted in cheers, and Sophie ran forward to throw herself at both of them. "We're a real family now," she shouted. "A real, actual, forever family." Grace held her tight. This child she'd saved, this child who'd saved her right back. "Yes, baby. Forever." The adoption papers came through 6 months later. Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document that officially made Sophie her daughter. Not just in her heart where Sophie had lived for years, but in the eyes of the law. Sophie Grace Anderson. They'd given her Grace's name as her middle name, Sophie's idea. "So I can carry you with me always," she'd explained, "even when you're not there." Grace traced her finger over the words, tears blurring her vision. Richard came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. "You okay?" "I'm more than okay." She turned to look at him. "I never thought I'd have this. A family. A daughter. A life that looked like this. You earned it." "I didn't earn anything. I just loved her." "That's what I mean." Richard kissed the top of her head. "You loved her when no one asked you to. You protected her when no one believed you. You fought for her when the whole world told you to stay quiet." He pulled back and met her eyes. "That's not nothing, Grace. That's everything." Sophie burst through the kitchen door, backpack bouncing. "I'm home. Can I see it? Can I see the paper?" Grace held it out, and Sophie took it reverently, reading the words with moving lips. "Sophie Grace Anderson." She looked up, her eyes shining. "That's me. That's you. And you're my mom now, like officially." "Officially?" Sophie set down the paper and threw her arms around Grace's neck. "I always knew you were my mom. Even before the paper said so. Even before the wedding. Even before Charlotte." Her voice dropped to a whisper. You were my mom the first time you sang me to sleep." Grace held her daughter, and let the tears fall. "And you were my baby from the first moment I held you." Richard joined the embrace, the three of them standing in the kitchen, where so much had happened, where poison had been poured, and evidence had been gathered, and a family had been broken and remade. "Group hug," Sophie announced. "Official family group hug." They laughed and held each other tighter, and for that moment nothing else existed. Not the past, not Charlotte rotting in her prison cell, not the reporters who still occasionally showed up looking for a new angle on an old story. Just love, just family, just home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Grace was sorting mail when she saw the prison postmark. Her blood went cold. She knew who it was from before she opened it. For a long moment she just held it, feeling the weight of the envelope, wondering if she should throw it away unopened. Let Charlotte's words rot in the garbage where they belonged. But curiosity won. Or maybe something else. Maybe the need to know that it was really over. She opened the letter. The handwriting was elegant, precise. Of course it was. Charlotte Veronica, whatever her name was, had always been precise. "Dear Grace," it began. "I've been thinking about you. I have a lot of time to think in here, as I'm sure you can imagine. 23 hours a day in a cell gives a person perspective. I used to hate you. I blamed you for everything. For seeing through me when no one else did. For gathering evidence instead of confronting me directly. For being smarter than I gave you credit for. But lately, I've started to see things differently. You won. Not because you were luckier or richer or more powerful. You won because you loved Sophie more than I loved money. You won because you were willing to risk everything for someone else's child. I've never understood that kind of love. I'm not sure I'm capable of it. Maybe that's why I'm in here, and you're out there living my life. Don't worry, I'm not writing to threaten you, or beg for forgiveness, or claim innocence. We both know what I did. We both know why. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that I think about you every day, not with hatred anymore. With something closer to fascination. You were invisible. A housekeeper. Someone people looked right through. And you took down a woman who'd fooled CEOs, doctors, lawyers, and a man worth billions. Part of me almost respects that. Almost. Enjoy your life, Grace, the one you built on my ruins. I hope Sophie grows up strong and happy, and nothing like me. And I hope sometimes you remember that it could have been different. If you'd just looked the other way like everyone else. But you didn't. That's the difference between us, I suppose. Veronica. Grace read the letter twice. Then she walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched it burn. She didn't tell Richard about the letter. She didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to tell. Charlotte's words were ash now floating up the chimney and into the wind, disappearing like she should have disappeared years ago. Some things didn't deserve to be remembered. Some monsters didn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing they still had power. Grace went back to her life. To her family, to the daughter who needed her, and the husband who loved her, and the home they'd built from the wreckage of someone else's evil. That was Charlotte's real punishment, Grace realized. Not the prison cell. Not the 25 years before parole. It was knowing that everything she'd tried to destroy had survived, had thrived, had become something beautiful. Charlotte had tried to murder a child for money. Instead, she'd created a family. There was justice in that. A cosmic irony that Grace found deeply, profoundly satisfying. Sophie turned 8 on a sunny day in September. The party was bigger than previous years. Her classmates, her teachers, her therapist, Dr. Chen Marcus, and his new girlfriend neighbors who'd become friends. The backyard was filled with balloons and streamers and a bouncy castle that Richard had insisted on, despite Grace's protests that it was too much. "Nothing is too much for my daughter," he'd said. And that was that. Sophie moved through the crowd like a small tornado of joy, hugging everyone, showing off her new dress, introducing Grace to her friends as, "My mom, well, one of my moms, the other one's in heaven, but she watches over me." Grace watched from the edge of the party, her heart so full it hurt. Richard appeared beside her, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "She's something else, isn't she?" "She really is. You know, she wrote about you for her school essay last week, My Hero. 3 pages about how you saved her life and taught her to be brave." Grace's eyes stung. "She told me she wrote about her dog. She wanted it to be a surprise. The teacher called me crying." Richard laughed. "Apparently the whole class cried. The teacher made copies for the school newsletter." "Richard, don't say you don't deserve it. Don't say it wasn't a big deal. Don't say you were just doing what anyone would do." He took her hand. "Because we both know that's not true. And Sophie knows it too." Grace watched her daughter. Their daughter laughing with her friends, blowing bubbles, living the childhood that Charlotte had tried to steal. "I never thought I'd have this," Grace said softly. "Any of this. A husband who loves me. A daughter who calls me her hero. A life that looks like a dream I never dared to dream. And now I wake up every morning and have to remind myself it's real. That I'm not going to wake up in my old apartment alone, getting ready to clean someone else's house." Richard squeezed her hand. "This is real, Grace. This is your life. You earned it. By accident. By being in the right place at the right time. By being brave when it mattered. By loving someone else's child like your own. By refusing to be silent when silence would have been so much easier." Richard turned to face her fully. "You didn't stumble into this life. You fought for it. Every single day you fought for it. And you won." Sophie ran over, breathless and grinning. "Mom, Dad, it's time for cake. Come on." She grabbed both their hands and pulled them toward the table, where a massive unicorn cake sat waiting, 8 candles flickering in the breeze. "Make a wish. Birthday girl," Grace said. Sophie closed her eyes, her face scrunched with concentration. Then she opened them, took a deep breath, and blew out every candle. The crowd cheered. Sophie beamed. "What did you wish for?" Richard asked. Sophie shook her head. "I can't tell. It won't come true." "Fair enough." Sophie grabbed a piece of cake and took an enormous bite, getting frosting all over her face. Grace laughed and reached for a napkin. "Actually," Sophie said, her mouth full, "I can tell you one thing." "What's that?" "I didn't wish for anything new." Sophie looked at Grace with those eyes that had seen too much and still sparkled with hope. "I just wished for this. Exactly this. Forever." Grace pulled her into a hug, not caring about the frosting, not caring about anything, except this moment, this child, this life. "Forever sounds perfect, baby." Later that night, after the guests had gone, and Sophie had crashed from her sugar high, Grace sat on the back porch watching the stars. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The juice boxes, the hidden camera, the courtroom, the letter that was now ash, the years of fear and healing and slowly learning to believe that good things could last. She thought about the woman she used to be, the invisible housekeeper, the one people looked right through, the one who'd spent her whole life cleaning up other people's messes and never expecting anything in return. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone Grace had known a long time ago in another life. The back door opened. Richard came out and sat beside her. "Sophie's asleep, crashed in her party dress. I didn't have the heart to change her. She had a good day. She had a perfect day." Richard leaned back. "Because of you. Because of us. No, because of you." He turned to look at her. "I was drowning when Charlotte came along. Drowning in grief and loneliness, in the terror of raising a daughter alone. I would have believed anything she told me. I would have let her destroy everything I loved because I was too broken to see clearly. Richard, you saved us, not just Sophie, me too. You gave me back my daughter and my life and my future. He took her hand. He took her. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm grateful every single day that you walked into our lives. Grace looked at their intertwined fingers, his pale, hers, dark, both weathered by time and struggle and survival. I used to think I was invisible, she said quietly. That people like me didn't get happy endings. We just got by. We survived. We kept our heads down and did our jobs and hoped nothing too terrible happened. And now I know that's not true. Now I know that invisible people can change the world, that one person's courage can save a life, that love doesn't care about money or status or the color of someone's skin. She looked up at the stars. Charlotte thought I was nothing. She thought she could poison a child right under my nose and I'd never notice. She thought she could threaten my job and I'd stay silent to protect myself. She underestimated you. Everyone did. Grace smiled. But Sophie didn't. Sophie always knew. Even when she was too young to understand what was happening, she knew I would protect her. She trusted me when I hadn't done anything to earn it. You'd earned it by loving her. That was enough. Grace nodded slowly. That was enough. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, feeling the peace that had taken so long to earn. Finally, Richard spoke. Do you ever regret it? Any of it? Grace thought about the question, really thought. I regret that Sophie had to suffer. I regret that I didn't figure it out sooner. I regret the nightmares and the therapy and the fear she had to carry. She paused. But regret what I did? Never. I would do it again. 1,000 times. 1,000,000 times. Whatever it took to keep her safe. That's what makes you different from Charlotte. What? Charlotte did everything for herself. Every scheme, every lie, every act of cruelty, all in service of her own ambition. She couldn't understand love because love requires putting someone else first. Richard squeezed Grace's hand. You put Sophie first from the very beginning, before you even knew there was danger, before anyone asked you to. You loved her without expecting anything in return. That's not special. That's just what you do when you love someone. It's exactly what's special. Richard turned to face her. Grace, you need to understand something. What you did wasn't ordinary. It wasn't what anyone would have done. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. You didn't. You couldn't. Because you loved a little girl more than you feared the consequences. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I was so scared, she whispered. The whole time. I was terrified Charlotte would find out. Terrified no one would believe me. Terrified I would lose everything, and Sophie would still die. But you did it anyway. I had to. There was no other choice. There's always another choice. Richard wiped a tear from her cheek. You chose courage. You chose love. You chose to be the person Sophie needed even when it cost you everything. Grace leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his strength, his unwavering presence. I love you, she said. I love you too. More than I ever thought I could love anyone again. They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead, as the night deepened around them, as their daughter slept safely in her bed, dreaming dreams untainted by poison or fear. Grace thought about Charlotte alone in her cell, surrounded by concrete and regret. She thought about Sophie, surrounded by love, growing stronger every day. And she thought about herself, the invisible woman who'd become a wife, a mother, a hero. Not because she'd wanted to be, because she'd loved a child enough to fight for her. That was the truth Charlotte never understood. Love wasn't weakness. Love was the strongest force in the universe. It could survive poison and betrayal and 23 years of being invisible. It could turn a housekeeper into a hero and a broken family into something whole. Grace Williams had walked into the Anderson mansion as hired help. She walked out as proof that courage could change everything. And somewhere in the night, in a prison cell far away, Charlotte Hayes finally understood what she'd lost. Not money, not freedom, not even Richard. She'd lost to love, and love had won forever.